All right, everybody, welcome back to the Remix Morning Show right here on Black Liberation Media. Amber, Geechee, Kamal, Jared, and our special guest joining us today, Nick Estes, who, among many other things, is an American Lakota community organizer, journalist, and historian at the University of Minnesota, and he has co-founded the Red Nation and Red Media podcasts and media outlets, and doing great work. Nick, it's a pleasure to finally get you to join us. Welcome. Good morning. Peace.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
It's cold here in Minneapolis.
Yeah, oddly, it's even cold here in Maryland, which is increasingly getting warmer. Seeing less and less snow every year. But listen, I do like when guests set us up with some homework assignments and things to review. To sort of frame a conversation. I'm happy to have you take this in any way, that you'd like, any direction you'd like. But I did watch this Vow of Silence, right? The Anna Mae story. I forgot the whole title, but on Hulu, which, as I texted you, I thought was a wild psychological warfare hit job on not only Indigenous history struggles, liberation struggles in general, COINTELPRO, but specifically Leonard Peltier. It was almost shocking to see. I say almost to see how this series, with no primer, no real framing, discussion, nothing, just throws him in there as basically a violent hitman, and then they leave it at that. Mm-hmm. So if there's ever anyone who ever watches this and then comes across his name later, there's going to be zero empathy for this political prisoner and that history that he represents. So that was one of the things that I took from this. But with that, sort of foundation, let me turn it over to you. What does this series do? How do you contextualize it, and how do you think, to the extent people watch it, it should be responded to?
Sure. Well, first, let me introduce myself. Hamataki. I'm actually from the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. This was just Sichangu. We're part of the Ocheti Shakoi. Born and raised in South Dakota. And in fact, I was in college at the time that these trials were happening for her alleged murders, for Anna Mae alleged murders. And I remember reading this stuff in the newspaper. And at that time, I didn't really have like a critical frame of reference to really respond or ask questions about what was going on. I think the general consensus, I was teaching summer high school in Rapid City at the time, where all these trials took place. Rapid City has the name of racist city, meaning that it's a notoriously anti-Indian border town in the heart of our territory in Chisapa, or a place we call that is also known as the Black Hills. And so this happened at a time. I want to talk a little bit about the context of like these trials, because I think it's important, because we're almost like almost 2 decades out from those trials, which started in 2000 and concluded in 2011. And at that time, the American Indian movement, what was left of it, was really kind of destroyed in terms of its credibility as an organization, even its legacy, which I think is incredibly important, because this becomes then a forbidden history for academics like myself to talk about. Because how can you write and talk about an organization that is inherently misogynist, that assassinates women who are on the rise? This is the narrative that was coming out of these trials, because sadly we haven't had books by Native people sympathetic with the liberation tradition written about the American Indian movement. Most of the books are written by non-Native people. There are a few autobiographies which are good, but there hasn't been sort of a comprehensive book. And this isn't a plug for myself, but this is my frustration. This is the book that I didn't want to write, so I began to research. And one of the first questions that you get as somebody who's researching the American Indian movement is, who killed Anna Mae? And that was something that frustrated me from the very beginning, because I joined the Leonard Peltier campaign back in 2013, officially working for his campaign, organizing events, organizing marches, teach-ins, movie showings, all those kinds of things, letter writing campaigns. And that was something that really that kind of bothered me, because if Leonard Peltier had something to do with her murder, how could I, as somebody is like an indigenous person, a Lakota person, advocate for this man's clemency? So I'll just put that out there. And I also just want to do a quick overview of this film, so those of you who are out there don't have to watch this Disney produced Hulu documentary. And I'll give the narrative, and then I'll critique the narrative, because I think that's important to do. So this film is a 4-part series. I'll say, first of all, if you watch the film, the documentary kind of evidence that they bring in terms of the film archive is actually pretty phenomenal. They do some restoration on some of these color archival footage that they found, which is really phenomenal. I thought it really brought that era to life. As somebody who's done the research and looked at some of the same films, some of the same archives that these producers have looked at, I was pretty blown away by that aspect of it. So I want to give that sort of a shout out, because that's actually kind of one of the cool things about the documentary, is that it does give you that kind of imagery of that time period. I don't think a documentary has done that yet. Most of what we see is black and white, the same sort of images that are produced by sort of the mass media. But generally, beyond the sort of archival footage, the documentary repeats this sort of narrative that was created by a native journalist named Paul Demain, and he's featured heavily in the documentary itself. Paul Demain, he founded this outlet called News from Indian Country. He was somebody who was kind of adjacent to the American Indian movement during the novitiate takeover in 1975. There was an armed takeover in Wisconsin of a monastery that had been abandoned. That's kind of featured in the film. And he was there, and he talks about the scene where they somebody points a gun at him, and an A member allegedly points a gun at him and says, "Are you a snitch?" And that's kind of when he was like, we need to question, the values of the American Indian movement. But he also kind of casts himself kind of revealingly as an outsider to, Native politics, somebody who didn't grow up in Native communities. Not to fault him, he was adopted out. He didn't know he was Native until later on in life, which sadly is the case of a lot of people because of the genocidal policies that we faced. But instead of, maybe trying to correct the record, I think he kind of falls into the trap of, just really, there's no other way to put this. I'm trying not to be vulgar, but just sucking from the teat of the FBI in terms of the information that he's getting. And I know this for several reasons. I've done the research, and something that isn't necessarily revealed in this documentary, but in the 90s, there was a major split that was happening within the American Indian movement, and it also centered on the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee, and I'll get into that later. So I think it's just important to kind of put that out there, that Paul Demain is this figure, and this is kind of his story. This is the story that he published on the pages of News from Indian Country, and he's kind of getting these leads and this information and these leaks from the investigators themselves. So this kind of follows, Anna Mae, she joins the American Indian movement. She's part of the Boston Indian Council in the 70s. She kind of has a falling out with her husband at that time. She leaves her children to join the Red Power movement as she sees it, joining the American Indian movement. She aligns herself with Dennis Banks, who then becomes her lover. There's jealousy and animosity, according to the filmmakers, and this narrative that's being portrayed around Anna Mae rise within the ranks of the American Indian movement. Anna Mae is depicted as somebody who, who's down for the cause. She's not going to sit in the kitchen. She's going to take up a gun and stand with the men. That's kind of the way she's portrayed in this documentary. She's at the Siege of Wounded Knee in 1973, where she marries Nogashik, her husband. She divorces her previous husband, Jake Maloney, who's Mi'kmaq, and Jake kind of gets custody of their children, and her children are actually kind of central to this story as well. Her daughter, Denise, kind of becomes this outspoken advocate for her mother. She's featured heavily in this documentary. And, you know, from 1973 to Anna Mae Aquash's murder in 1975, we kind of get this picture of AIM disintegrating following Wounded Knee. There's a lot of rumors about conspiracy. You know, there's a major FBI infiltrator or a self-described operative named Douglas Durham who's outed. He's actually very close to Anna Mae, not in terms of they're not friends, but in terms of their alignment. Both of them are with the sort of Banks faction. And so he begins, you know, she's suspicious of him and he's also suspicious of her. And so there's kind of an implication. It's not overtly said that he kind of puts this, you know, a bad jacket or a snitch jacket on her, saying that she could be the potential infiltrator. And after he's outed, you know, the depiction in the film is that AIM sort of descends into chaos of a finger pointing. Well, who's the FBI operative? Who's the undercover? And so in 1975, at a Farmington meeting in Farmington, New Mexico, there's a brutal slaying of these Navajo men in Farmington. That's a whole that kind of falls to the wayside. It's like the background information, but there was these individuals in Farmington, New Mexico, who were mutilated and murdered by white children, essentially, and their body parts were hung in their school lockers. It was called the Farmington Massacre. So AIM came down to respond. They were invited by the community to come down to respond. And at this Farmington convention, that's when, you know, the fingers start pointing at Anna Mae Aquash officially, that she's the snitch. She's just like Doug Durham. You know, she's a FBI infiltrator. So let's get, you know, our bag man, you know, Leonard Peltier, who's just a thug. That's kind of how he's depicted in this film, to go put a gun to her head and ask her whether or not she's an FBI informant. And from there, it kind of, the narrative kind of falls off the rails, in my opinion, because actually what happens from that point onwards is incredibly important, but they don't get into any of those details. What ends up happening is that there's the shootout in Oglala in June of 1975. Leonard Peltier goes on the run. Anna Mae Aquash joins them. Peltier, Banks, and Kamuk Nichols, who's talked about. Also, Kamuk's sisters is with them, Bernie Nichols. They get a motorhome. They're stopped in Oregon. You know, Dennis Banks and Leonard Peltier flee. Both Anna Mae and Kamuk are arrested and jailed. Anna Mae's extradited to South Dakota because she has outstanding charges for explosives. And then a judge grants her basically, you know, she had a hearing, and she, instead of staying overnight in jail to get that hearing in the morning, the judge lets her out for the evening. And then from that point, she basically becomes a fugitive again. And she flees from South Dakota to Denver. And in Denver, she goes to Troyland Yellowwood's home, where she's basically interrogated by her accusers. People, you know, they name Theda Clark, which I'll get to later, as one of the accusers of Anna Mae Aquash as being an FBI informant. And she's the reason why they were stopped in Oregon and why they got caught. And so from there, they take her to the Wounded Knee Legal Defense House in Rapid City, interrogate her. They take her to the reservation. There's kind of ambiguity about what happens, but then ultimately she's assassinated. She's killed. She's dumped on the roadside outside of a place called Scenic and I forgot my South Dakota geography. But it's on the border or on the edge of the Pine Ridge Reservation in the Badlands. And so that's where the story kind of like, that's the arc of the story. And then of course you have these two sort of hero cops. You have Hispanic, Latino, a police officer from Denver, and then you have a Native man who's the first U.S. Marshal, and he has a vision. Like, this is no joke. He has a vision. He has a vision about Anna Mae Aquash's murder while he's in a, you know, as a jailer in Pine Ridge, and then he decides, I'm gonna crack the case. So he grows his hair long, teams up with his buddy Alonzo in Denver, and his name is Bob Ekefee, and then they crack the case and they reveal all this thing, and there's this implication that, oh, maybe there's a little bit of racism within the FBI and they didn't pay enough attention, and that's why they could never solve the murder. And so it's this kind of like propaganda story arc where it's like, at the end of the day, the very people who were trying to destroy the movement and who had killed actual AIM members thus become the saviors, right? And I think this movie does a really good job at kind of like condensing that narrative and putting it into a very watchable film. You know, I had people texting me throughout, and it's like, the sad thing about doing this work is like, everyone wants to show you stuff like, what's your opinion on this really awful thing that I just watched? And so I was forced to watch it, and Jared reached out and wanted me to come on the show, and I was like, if I'm gonna come on the show, I'm gonna talk about this. And if I'm gonna talk about this, you're gonna watch it too. So Jared watched it.
And if I can, I just want to co-sign a couple of the points that you made here. One, to your point about the quality of the film, this for me is increasingly a problem. Mm-hmm. that we are getting more sophisticated, higher quality propaganda. And if you don't know any of this history, you would watch this series and just be like, wow, this is just amazing. And yeah, this Peltier guy is a thug, and AIM is just a collapsing mess. And what struggle were they associated with in general? Like, it's weird. But, even the 75 Pine Ridge incident, I thought, okay, I was like, okay, now we're about to, I even went back and watched it again. It's like quick, 2 FBI agents get killed, a native guy gets killed, and then we move on. And I'm like, what? I was like, wait a minute, what? Almost none of the real content. So it was just so, but all to drive, as you said, the story that the police are ultimately good. They're doing the best they can. It's these natives running around here killing each other. And it's so complicated. What more could we expect from the FBI? It was kind of like they're interviewing FBI agents. This indigenous guy you're talking about you're meant to feel his pride in becoming the first in the federal government to go and become this native hunter from the people themselves. It's so crazy, but it's done in a way that if you don't have a certain view, it's gonna. So I just wanted to co-sign those couple of points.
I also think it's interesting that the narrative that they show for this documentary is completely different from the one they show about the IRA, because they make you want to believe in the police and that the native people are so bad. But in the IRA one, they got people looking up, what's the Irish Republican Army? Like, this is a real movement. Like, they was really powerful. These were political heroes. They was having a hunger strike for over 200 days. Like, the whole narrative is different for these white people, Irish people. But they was
interesting. It would be interesting to do a full-on comparison. I think you make a good point there.
And they're both
even the documentary,
they're both on Hulu, and then Hulu's been putting out this very politically charged content lately.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point. I haven't seen the IRA documentary, but I've seen the sort of production around a lot of the Black Panther films, like even the what was it, Judas and the Black Messiah, and it's interesting. There's a lot of criticism for that film, I think, which I don't want to get into here, but in some ways it's portraying the Panthers in a positive light. But it's in some ways it's also doing the same thing that this film is doing, is it's creating a martyr out of somebody. It's like, it's only good revolutionary is a dead revolutionary, right? And then they can only be redeemed by the police. That's the narrative in this particular film. And I want to back up a little bit, because I think it is important, Jared, what you point out about the shootout in 1975. And I also, in my research, it's not that I'm against the label of COINTELPRO, but I want to say that this is something, the tactics that were used were entirely different in many ways, because even the assassination of Fred Hampton wasn't directed by an actual FBI agent. He didn't pull the trigger, but the siege on Wounded Knee was actually FBI agents with armaments from the United States military engaging in their own words, paramilitary tactics. And they released a document in April of 1975 justifying the occupation, the paramilitary occupation of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, not for solving this spate of murders, rapes, beatings that were taking place on the reservation post 1973. They were there to destroy the American Indian movement and to anticipate some kind of military engagement with them. This is April, several months before the shootout. So it's important to point that out. That I don't know what that's not COINTELPRO. That's just the paramilitarization of the FBI. And in my research, I found that this is a unique turning point. Yeah, Hoover's dead, right? The FBI is reforming itself. It's doing something entirely different. And Wounded Knee happens in the wake of Hoover's death. And this is the first time you see the FBI creating its own special operations groups, engaging in militarized tactics, and even training. It's mentioned a little bit in this film. It's the first time somebody interviewed David Price on film, who's this notorious FBI agent at that time. But he admitted, he's like, yeah, we didn't give them a hunting, or we didn't give them rifles directly. We just gave it to them for their prairie dog shooting program or whatever. And it was the first time that they admitted that they were actually supplying the vigilante arm of the tribal government with high-powered rifles. There's also hundreds of pages of documents from the Department of Military. They had this program at the time where they would loan military equipment to federal agencies to crush, civil unrest. And there's very few instances that program was actually used, and one of them was Wounded Knee. You actually had F-4, fighter jets flying over. You had APCs. You had, for the first time, the Bureau of Indian Affairs police being trained with these high-powered, military-grade equipment. And it was kind of fascinating too. The documents that I read about some of these BIA police and the U.S. Marshals. They kind of made fun of the FBI because the FBI they didn't like to get their hands dirty. They would always get somebody else to do it. So it was the first time that they actually had to engage in firefights with people. And for the first time, they experienced a sense of risk and danger, something that culminated in 1975 in June at the Oglala shootout, where two of their agents were killed. That's a big deal. It is underplayed at that point. And, FBI agents themselves have come forward and said that the continued incarceration of Leonard Peltier is a continuing FBI vendetta. And I want to back up a little bit because I want to just push back on the overall narrative of this film with just facts versus just, I can, as an academic, I can make sort of theoretical arguments about the structure of the repressive state, and what it does to social movements. But I think just looking at the facts here, especially in the lead up to Anna Mae Aquash's murder in December of 1975, is incredibly important. So we have the shootout in June. Anna Mae actually comes back to the reservation looking to meet up with Leonard Peltier. Now, why would that make sense if this man held a gun to her head and said, "Are you an FBI informant?" Why would she want to meet up with him? Well, it's because, according to Peltier and Bob Robidoux, who was a co-defendant of Leonard Peltier, Anna Mae Aquash was sort of taken under the wing of Peltier's outfit for protection, right? And there's even a dispute about that incident where he allegedly had interrogated her at gunpoint.
Because it's only her word we get, right? I mean, they were the only two
Exactly.
people there, right? So there's no right. Sorry, yeah.
And I don't want to say too much about that, other than to say that I know from talking to folks that it didn't go down like that. Leonard and Anna Mae were friends, and he wouldn't do that. Let's just say that. But let's say that story, to kind of quell, these suspicions, might sound better if she said, if it looked like that she was held at the point of a gun. Let's just say that. That's what was insinuated. It was something that was made up. And then it gets used against him later on, right? So he takes her under his outfit, and he's with Dino Butler, Bob Robidoux. That's those are his co-defendants. Those are Leonard Peltier's co-defendants in the shootout. And so if this man had just threatened her life, why would she risk everything to go meet up with him? Especially when he's so hot at that moment, when the entire FBI is looking for him, right? That doesn't make any sense. And then, when she is, when she does meet up with him and they're on that Oregon thing, like it doesn't make sense that even after she's arrested in Oregon in 1975 and extradited back to South Dakota, that she's going to be like, hey, you know what a really great idea would be is to abscond, go on the run, be a fugitive, and then go meet back up with this guy and try to meet up with Dennis Banks. That doesn't make does that sound like somebody who was fearful of their life, of the people who were surrounding them? To me, that sounds like you're just walking into the fire, and I don't think she was that stupid, to do those things. But there's this, she goes to Denver. This did happen. She goes to Denver in 1970, in November of 1975. And there you do have Theda Clark. You do have the other two people, Arlo Looking Cloud and John Boy Graham, who are there. They've all admitted to being there. It's in some capacity. So they go there, and Theda Clark is the one who begins to interrogate her. She's the one who actually first accused her in the Farmington Convention previously that year. And they have this kind of bogus document that says, informant A and B, that's why they were stopped in Oregon, and this is the reason why she's either informant A or B, and that's why they got stopped in Oregon. Well, according to FBI documents, they've been following them the entire time. And I don't think anyone in that group was an informant. I just think that they had intelligence. I mean, they're driving around in Marlo Brandon's mobile home. Marlo Brando's mobile home.
Marlon Brando,
not,
yeah.
That's not inconspicuous. So anyways, she's there being interrogated in Denver, and then it's Theda's, there's this phone call, there's all this stuff that happens, like let's bring her to Rapid City. So they bring her to Rapid City, and from my accounts, from what I understand, this did happen. She was brought into the Wickledock office, and they did ask her, but from what I was told, they were just like, get out of here. Why is you as a fugitive coming to the defense attorney's offices, like the AIM house? That puts everybody in jeopardy. And so people were angry that she had showed up. Like, from the people I spoke, they were angry that she had showed up, because it's like, this house is being surveilled, and so she does leave. What happens after that is she gets murdered. But the crucial point here is that in December 1975, December 19th to be precise, an FBI informant in Denver notifies his handler in what are called, these 302 reports, that Anna Mae was murdered the week prior after being held in Denver, and she was murdered by Theda Clark, John Boy Graham, and Arlo Looking Cloud. That doesn't come up in the documentary at all. I'm not some kind of like genius researcher, like I got this secret FBI document. This has been out in the public since at least 2011 that this was known. But this FBI informant lets the FBI know this person was killed. This is who did it. This is when it happened. So why did it take until February of the next, or actually March of the next year, so December to March, for them to identify the body? And when they showed up on scene, I thought that was a masterful reconstruction, just a pure fabrication. when they showed up and they were like, oh, it's, we found this person who was thrown off on the side of the road, and it was just, it was just exposure. If it was just an exposure death, if it was just another dead Indian, is basically what they were trying to say, then why would David Price, why would Bob Ecafee, why would all of these agencies be out on that scene, right? And remember, David Price even admits in that interview that he said, yeah, I was looking for her. So he knew what she looked like. He had a profile. You even look at the description of his FBI reports of what Anna Mae Aquash looked like, and it noted, it detailed her jewelry, and that jewelry that is like as a key piece throughout the entire film. And he couldn't identify her at the crime scene, and then they put her off. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just want to clarify, because in the documentary, in the series, we're shown Looking Cloud, Theta, and the third, I forget the third,
John Graham.
Theta and John Graham. They are all named, identified as having likely been the killers.
Exactly.
Theta, I think, is she herself killed, or
no,
she's never charged? I can't remember what the text said, but I just want you to clarify that that we're shown that they're the alleged killers, but we're never shown this point that you're making about the FBI document revealing the names months earlier, and that the FBI, as I'm hearing your point, the FBI is the source for the claim that these are the killers.
Yeah.
Am I hearing you?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's correct.
Okay.
This informant, who actually the informant was actually the intimate partner of the person whose house they were being held at in Denver. I think that's important to point out. And I also think it's important to point out that the theory of the case is that it wasn't just Theta Clark who, got a hair up her butt and decided to kill this person. It was an orchestrated conspiracy by AIM leadership to have her assassinated. That's the theory of the case, right?
And then we're shown all of the AIM leadership: Russell Means, Dennis Banks, John Trudell, Belcourt. They're all either I don't know, or that one did it, or they might have been involved. I don't, it was a whole bunch of finger pointing or non-acceptance of involvement. Okay, sorry, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So they're at this crime scene. And it's important. David Price in that film actually says, like, yeah, he knew what he looked like, but he didn't know what she looked like then, or didn't question like what were the circumstances of this. I mean, there was a lot of decomposition of her body at that time, but at the same time, they had that pathologist who kind of declared that she was just a Jane Doe, and she was that she had died of exposure, and she's probably like, drunk or whatever, it was a very racist thing. And so it was the family who demanded that there be, an exhumation and then another autopsy done. And that's when this guy from Minneapolis goes down and he finds that there was a bullet in her head, a 32 caliber bullet. And so that's the kind of the story, right? And then after that, the case goes cold until the 90s, right? And this mysterious box of, this is, I don't know if they played this up in the film, but in the trailer, they were like, if you watch the trailer to this film, a mysterious box arrives at the producer's homes, and it contains all these FBI recordings. Well, those FBI recordings are from a paid FBI informant, Kamuk Nichols, who was formerly married to Dennis Banks. His wife turns FBI informant. What is not mentioned in the documentary, and this might be shocking to you, Jared, is that Kamuk actually, during the course of the trial and investigations, becomes intimate with Bob Ecafee, the lead investigator, and then marries him in the midst of the trial. So she can't testify against him, and he can't testify against her. That seems like a crucial element, to just kind of gloss over. Oh, by the way, the lead informant, the main informant, the key witness, is married to The key investigator.
Why they always skip over the messy stuff? That's the good part.
Yeah.
They should have done a whole series just on that. Right. Yeah. No.
Because I need them to include the messiness with the revolutionary stories. I need to know that they're well-rounded. You know, they had the tea, they had a roster, they was doing a lot, they had 3 divorces. We need to know all of it.
but sort of to Amber's point, the tea that they do share in the documentary is meant to further the narrative they want to tell. So they do get into Anna Mae had relationships with this one, with that one. So and so was mad that her ex was mad that she moved on to Dennis Banks. That was there was some of that in there, but it's all sort of to push the narrative that basically AIM and the Native community is a mess, and has nothing to do with the context of what the state has been doing. It's just these folks are a mess. The FBI is doing the best they can, with the help of these good informants and firsts to prosecute and all this, So yeah, but that would have been an interesting detail to include if they were wanting any sort of honesty. Yeah. All right.
So in the course of the trials, I mean, it's important to point out that there was no physical evidence that tied any of these people to the actual murder. It was all just he said, she said kind of thing. And the main she said was Kamuk, testifying against her former comrades and, her former husband. Which seemed, that's a huge betrayal, I think. And I think that really blew people's mind at that time. And I think Leonard Peltier even said it's like getting stabbed in the heart, and it's also, I think, just to point out that, to refocus a little bit. So Theda Clark is the main conspirator, according to this, the state's theory of the case. But they spend the state and these documentary filmmakers spend almost no time talking about her, which I thought was kind of fascinating. It's all the men, the men who orchestrated everything. But the leadership at that time, the male leadership at that time, couldn't even be in a room together. There was so much differences and conflict among them, right? That this idea that they all sat in a room and were press the button, so to speak, to carry out this hit. This doesn't make any sense. And they would probably, if they were alive today, they would probably all say that, but
because they always trying to erase where women were in the movement, that we were actually in charge.
That's another important element here. And I think reading these documents and reading the narrative that the FBI puts out, the FBI was obsessed with the men. You look at these documents. I even looked at some of the surveillance photographs. A lot of these press people that were going in, FBI, BIA would pay them for their B-rolls. And so you would get that. And that's how they would make identifications. But there were so many women there. There were so many children there. It was as was told to me by, Madonna Thunderhawk, AIM was a movement of families, right? It wasn't just a bunch of dudes, which is kind of portrayed in this film. It was a movement of families, but the media and the FBI chose the leadership. They chose the spokespeople. And when this crackdown happened after Wounded Knee, they weren't really interested in what the women were doing. It was completely invisible to them. So they kept the movement going. Parts of the movement did go underground, but just because, Dennis Banks was, on the run, or Leonard Peltier, or Russell Means, whoever was on the run, didn't mean that the schools shut down, that the community programs went away, that the organizing just stopped. The women just continued it. They even formed an organization called Women of All Red Nations, which was, the indigenous women's movement within the American Indian movement. They went to the United Nations in 1975. They were touring. They were going to Beirut. They were going to, Palestine. They were going to the Soviet Union in the 80s. They were connecting with the Sandinistas in the 80s. They were still a vibrant movement. But according to this narrative, they fell from grace. The men, got too drunk on their power, too obsessed with their own images, and it completely erases what comes after. So it's destroyed the legacy of the American Indian movement. It's reframed it as something that can be reduced to personalities, right? And that's the intent of, that's the effect if not the intent of what the FBI did. I mean, even what's also not addressed at all in this film is the brutality that the FBI went through to threaten and to coerce Native women to turn against their own people. Like Jean Roach is featured in this film, and I don't want to speak on her behalf, but she was, I trust Jean. And she was she was 14 years old at the time of the shootout in Oglala. This is her story to tell, by the way. If you ever want to have her on the podcast or your show, she would be a great person to interview. And she was 14 years old, and she refused to testify at a grand jury. She was 14 years old. They threatened her. They threatened to, threaten her mother, threaten her family. They went after a child, 14 years old. And a lot of those people at that camp at Oglala they were young people. It wasn't some the oldest people were Dino Butler, Bob Robidoux, and Leonard Peltier. The rest of them were effectively kids. And so they paint them off as this militant revolutionary organization, blah, 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 but they're really just attacking kids. And so what does that say about the FBI? And Myrtle Poorbear, this woman who had severe mental health issues, they threatened to take away her children. David Price, the guy who was featured in this film, threatened to take away her children, coerced her to testify, against Key AIM leadership, to testify against, Leonard Peltier. She later retracted that, but that was after the immense amount of threats that they put on her, threatened to kill her. They even, according to her, showed her photos of Anna Mae Aquash's dead body and said, this could happen to you if you don't cooperate. And so somehow these people, there's this other element here that there's two things that I want to, I know we're running out of time, but there's two elements that I want to talk about. One is the very plausible reality that Theda Clark was an FBI informant. And the second one is to talk about this idea of murdered missing Indigenous women, this movement that has sprung up, and it really kind of launched as a campaign in the 90s, around the time this investigation was restarted and reignited, and how the murder of Anna Mae Aquash has been taken up by the FBI. The FBI, the very perpetrators of violence against Indigenous women at this time, are now the arbiters of justice for these women. And to go back to Pine Ridge, the Pine Ridge reservation, the Oglala Sioux tribe sued the FBI recently, sued the Department of Justice, because there were so many unsolved murders, unsolved rapes, unsolved cases of violence against Indigenous women, because even though there was a large influx of federal dollars for policing, these crimes were not being solved. So it begs the question, what is the purpose of the FBI in this scenario? According to our jurisdiction as Indian reservations, they're considered federal jurisdiction. So the FBI has supreme jurisdiction. They're the ones who are in charge of investigating major crimes such as murder and rape. But what we've seen them do has just become essentially a colonial police force that is meant to destroy our political movements. They've attempted to destroy the American Indian movement. Last thing I want to say, if there are any more questions, is that there have been credible accusations from leaders themselves, people who are not in this film, people who are on the ground. There's a man named Ernesto V. Hill. He was a Chicano organizer in Denver at the time. I listened to a podcast he did with just randomly. He was part of the Crusade for Justice, and he kind of laid out the details of the case. And at that time, I was researching the details of the case, and he plugged in some key questions that I had that just didn't add up, because I was sitting there holding this FBI document that said they knew who killed her in December 1975. Like, why is it not coming out until the 90s and the early 2000s that people get charged? And why is the person who's named in this document, or according to the state's theory of the case, the main perpetrator, never brought to trial? Why is there no focus on this? Those are like legitimate questions, that haven't been answered. This film does not answer those questions. And in fact, it obscures them. It doesn't even get into the other witnesses who became the key informants for the FBI. Cyril Chapman, who was a British national, he was in the, he was like aligned with the American Indian movement. He wrote several books. One was forwarded by Bill Clinton, the president. And it turns out he was a pretendian. He was pretending to be native at that time, a British national. I don't know, this is, again, the media and the state tends to pick our leadership. That doesn't come internally from us as much as your all fault as it is ours. But he becomes this person who starts writing the official book on the American Indian movement. And he starts going around in the 90s interviewing all these people. And he becomes a paid FBI informant. He gets what's called an S visa, a special visa, which is also known as a snitch visa, to become a key witness. He turns hundreds of thousands of dollars. He's being paid. He's later outed. He's reinvented himself. His name is like Rain Bear, I think. He recently did a documentary on MMIW. He met President Biden. It's wild how these people just completely reinvent themselves, and there's no accountability. There's no memory of this, but his testimony becomes the sort of key documents, and he basically becomes a DOJ informant or FBI informant because he gets a special visa to stay in the United States, an S visa, which is also known as a snitch visa. This is all public documents. I'm not like revealing any hard secrets here. This is something that anyone can go online and find. So he's another individual, and I bring him up because you have Kamuk Nichols and Cyril Chapman, who are the key state witnesses against, the American Indian movement. That's where they're resting their credibility on their theory of the case of these two key witnesses. And at that time there was a lot of things happening, but I would say that I don't know today if they could do what they did back then, but nonetheless, it set a narrative that is hard to disrupt. We did an episode on this allegation and this myth that Leonard Peltier had something to do with Anna Mae murder. Check it out on our platform, the Red Nation podcast, because we knew this film was coming out. We knew the executive producers on it. None of them are native. There was a different contentious history about how the film came about. I don't want to get into it now, but a lot of people I knew were really uncomfortable with even being interviewed by these filmmakers, even though the director herself is from our nation. She's Lakota, Yvonne Russo, because Cyril Chapman, said he was just, doing a book on the American Indian movement. Turns out that he's an FBI informant, but also the loaded nature in which, you're entering into a snake pit, essentially, when you agree to do these things. And we don't have control over the narrative.
Let me jump in. And you kind of said you didn't want to get too much into it, so I just want to get a little bit into it. I'm always interested in the why nows. So for like a documentary like this, in terms of sort of the continued battering of the AIM legacy, why do you think? Obviously, it's informally or formally an FBI production, but why now at this particular stage do you think this is being put out there the way it's being put out there, casting people as heroes and villains, and obviously portraying the law enforcement, particularly the FBI, as the heroes of the story, solving cases and so forth and so on?
I don't know the intent, but I can know that there's correlative kind of occurrences. One is the fact that Leonard Peltier is coming up for clemency. It tends to happen. I mean, at his last BOP hearing, Bureau of Prisons hearing for his parole, this was actually brought up. This accusation that he had something to do with the murder is completely bogus. And this was brought up in 2011 at the same, parole hearing that he had. There's that. There's also a really powerful growing movement that of Lakota people for land back. There's been a growing movement in the Black Hills and where I'm from around this. And what better way to delegitimize the legacy of that movement, to say you have no heroes. You have no, you have no ground. All your heroes are tarnished. They're murderers. And the effect of this is it's like kind of watching just like an old Western film in many ways. It's like the landscape, our issues as Lakota people become the background for this character, Anna Mae Aquash and her murder, and then the subsequent police who come in. We become the jealous type. We become the killers. We become the conspirators. That's the way it comes off. And a lot of people talked about that. My friends and family from back home, they're like, wow, this really portrays Lakota people in a really bad light. And so there's that kind of effect of it. It's like it's delegitimizing us. Like how can you take any of these people seriously? Because you can trace all their links back to this discredited, misogynist, murderous, homicidal movement, right? And it's also like it prevents us from even having a solid grasp on our history, right? And this is something as an academic that I'm really perplexed by. That the way, I know the PMC, professional managerial class, I know that in many ways Native people are, or not Native people, but academics are sort of tools of empire. They get inscripted into this, but it's strange to me how it's not strange, but it's always surprising to me how this critical thinking faculty can be turned off when we say, the leadership is misogynist, because then it reduces everything that AIM did. And a lot of the people they interviewed who were making these accusations were not even part of the movement. Some of them, Joy Harjo is the poet laureate, was the poet laureate of the United States. And she's making some pretty heavy accusations against the American Indian movement. And that might have to do with the fact that she knowingly crossed the BDS picket line. She's been called out by Native activists left and right for her Zionist tendencies. AIM was anti-Zionist. AIM was anti-imperialist.
They left that out of her lower third, by the way,
yeah.
when you watch the film.
So I wanted to lemon pepper cauliflower back off of Kamal, but so we talked about this before with Jared and a few other people in terms of how once something get popular, the film industry comes and like make sure that you look at it this way. And I don't know if it's like FBI, CIA doing it, or the creatives are seeing something popular happen and they like, oh, I should probably tell a story and try to sell it. Mm-hmm. But what I was looking at was this this thing that was published in 2018, and you see a supposedly former supporter of Leonard Peltier now I'm saying why I no longer support him. And then it goes into like the conversation around being more lenient or being in more support of Anna Mae's family. But then there's some comment down here that I wonder if any of these have accuracy. But this person was the only person who was kind of like, all right, this letter is bullshit. And then they went into like why it was false. But I wonder if this lady has something to do with it, or were there like very popular people who also was kind of flipping with Leonard Peltier that probably helped with this film. I haven't seen the film yet. I'm gonna watch it now, but I wonder if you can get into like maybe some of the people behind it.
Some of the people behind the film, yeah. I mean, according to like Paul Demain, who's the the main journalist, which by the way, I have this. I don't know if I brought this book, but these cops, they know. I mean, to the credit of publisher and corporate publishers, these publishers don't want to publish these police books, but I find them because they self-publish them on Amazon. Don't pick this up. Don't pick this up. Don't read this book. But this is Abe Alonso's, like, basically his case files. It's this total like narcissistic, self-aggrandizing thing, and in this, he admits that he and Paul Demain were working hand in hand. So you have a journalist, a native journalist, who's completely, discredit. I mean, we make this comment all the time, like, oh, journalists, are just the stenographers of empire. But it's like literally in here. It's in this book, and it's in this book, which is written by Joe Trimbach. which is the American Indian Mafia. And all you have to do is just look at who blurbed the book. You know, you have Oliver North and Paul Demain. And it says in here that the Richard Tuwelk, who is also featured in the film, wrote the introduction to this book. So these are the characters who are considered the experts. You know, Richard Tuwelk in this film, he's also one of those people, as you said, Geechee, that you know, who was like, I'm an AIM diehard, you know, and then like after Anna Mae, I came to God, you know, like I felt like this was something that I couldn't stand for anymore. And so then he becomes, you know, a sellout. He becomes an informant, essentially. That's a kind of like the narrative that they also, it's kind of in the film. Paul Demain kind of does this with Arlo, or excuse me, Richard Tuwelk does this with Arlo to say like he was the only person who has any kind of redemptive capacity or should be redeemed because he was the one who came forward. He stepped forward and said, you know, I was one of her killers. And it's sad because, you know, it portrays this thing where it's like all of a sudden, you know, there's these people who turn, like this person you're talking about on here, and their stories become centered, right? Never the people who were actually there, who witnessed this thing happen in real time, are still alive. You know, I've interviewed many of them, and they've told me, you know, I've tried to talk to people about this, but nobody will listen. They're not the stories that people want to hear. You know, these are from people, you know, like this. The sad thing about the AIM legacy and the industry around the Red Power movement is that it's also kind of created a bubble about who was actually involved. And many of the people that I've interviewed, just sort of foot soldiers of AIM, whether they're men, women, children, they have a much different story to tell and how things went down. And those stories, like what you're pointing out, those stories make great headlines and clickbait. And if you only have to look during the time of the trials to see a lot of these think pieces out. You know, Paul Demain wrote this whole thing about why I no longer, that was his kind of story arc too. He's like, I was, you know, once a supporter of Leonard Peltier, and now I can no longer support him because of what I know. You know, Leonard Peltier actually sued Paul Demain and said, it's libel for you to make an accusation that I had something to do with the murder of Anna Mae Aquash. And guess what? He won that libel suit. So it's a libelous claim, according to even this colonial court system, to even make that accusation, right? But Leonard Peltier doesn't have the resources, nor the time, nor the will to go around just suing people, making these accusations.
But then once that's done legally, then how could the documentary get away legally without including reference to that as they're allowing accusations of him to go off? By the way, to your previous point about who's still here, I said the same thing as I'm watching on the at one point they make reference to this, and then the text on the screen says something to the effect, by such and such a date, all of these leaders from AIM have died. Mm-hmm. Trudell, Bellencourt, Means, you know, and I'm like, Leonard's still here. I was like, you know, you name checked him, you know, you drag his ass in the documentary for 5 good minutes. He's still here. You know, you could have, but they don't do that. Then they also don't make reference to what you just said about this libelous case. So it brings me back to that initial question. Then how would they even? I mean, I get it. I get it. But legally speaking, there should have been some question about that inclusion in the documentary. If they don't even make reference to the fact that he's won a case on this claim. But yeah, I know.
I mean, he's a man in prison who's had all his rights taken away. So what does it mean? You can just dump more shit on, excuse my language, but you can just dump more shit on him.
Yeah. You
can cuss. Kamal's kid is gone now.
Yeah, Kamal took his kids. Kamal left with the baby. So, listen, I know, you know, we're relatively speaking, technically we're out of time, but although there's no official rule here about that, but to just be mindful of your time and everyone else's, I'll at least give you a chance to if there's any pressing questions from my comrades on screen, or if there's anything you wanted to make sure you left us with before we, officially wrap. And then hopefully we can do many more of these, and we'll definitely be encouraging, to the extent we haven't already, folks to check into your podcast and other work. I'm currently still myself reading, your Red Nation Rising book. So there's, I'd like to, I'm sure, we would all like to continue this engagement, but yeah, let me turn it over to any of you for anything, really. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment about the women in movement piece, because I do think it's really important. And I also struggle with the idea that maybe it's better for them not to know certain women are running things so that they can, lead it for such a long time. But there was a really good parallel in the Say Nothing documentary on Hulu about the IRA that heavily focused on the men too. And they were using women for like strategy and policy stuff and figuring out stuff in the background, but no one ever suspected them of anything because they were always focused on the men.
Say Nothing is great. I don't know. I can't vouch for its history. I don't know the history well enough to vouch for it, but I will say the series was great, and the questions and topics, even to Amber's point there, that you're invited to consider as a viewer is just delicious. So I would recommend you take some time and then maybe we could, do a part 2 with a comparison discussion.
I did fact check a lot of the stuff. It took me a very long time to watch it because I tend to stop watching stuff. So I would stop it and like look up all the stuff about what they were saying. They really did call them the Sisters of Terror. They really did do all those things, like that hunger strike. They did all of that. And I think that there's just so much to learn about that type of movement, like the way that literally no one ever would say anything, and they were able to go for so long without them even knowing what they looked like. Like wow. That's a real, actual, powerful movement that we don't have the type of like dedication to currently. Mainly because everybody want to be a celebrity activist on Instagram. So
that's yeah. Go ahead, Nick. Or yeah.
Any other questions? Well, I just wanted to say, like, this is something that I didn't want to do. I never wanted to. I'm being honest. I never wanted to do this work. I've had conversations with people who have lied to me. Before I've even started doing this research, I as a historian, as somebody who's like kind of specializes in oral histories, I want to talk to people first, because I think that people are saying, "Oh, memory's bad, blah 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 blah," but I actually want to know how they understand the story, like how it went down. And it was mind-blowing to me by people who even who were telling the truth, as far as I can tell, their truth, and also people who were just explicitly lying to me, that nobody really just sat down and talked to some of these folks, to get their perspectives. And this isn't something that's like, there's somebody be like, "Oh, you're trying to exonerate AIM," and I'm not trying to exonerate AIM. Like, I that's not my goal. Like, as a researcher, my goal is to, as somebody who's also been trained in journalism, is to get the facts. And the facts are just fundamentally wrong here. And as somebody who, we enter into this new phase of, we saw the Standing Rock protests happen, right? And the level of FBI involvement in that movement has not been fully accounted for. The level of FBI involvement, one of the first things that these private military firms were concerned about was the Standing Rock movement's international connections. Its connections to Black Lives Matter, its connections to the Palestine movement. These are all in the documents. They want us to be domesticated, isolated, narrowly focused in our movements, and we've never been narrowly focused in our movements. Even the water protector movement, as we know it today, they were talking about Venezuela and sanctions on Venezuela as related to the expansion of U.S. fossil fuel infrastructure to choke out the largest oil reserves in Venezuela, to destroy their government. And like, we recognize Hugo Chavez as somebody who came in and gave us heating assistance, when nobody else cared. Like, we live in some of the poorest places. I was a beneficiary of that. And that, you can say whatever you want, but that, at the end of the day, you can't eat ideology, and at the end of the day, what warms your house, and this narrative around the FBI and these state forces are trying to destroy the very things that have given us hope, that have moved history forward, that have provided opportunities and possibilities for us to kind of break these chains and these shackles and these things that have confined us. But for some reason, like as somebody who's been involved in the movement, like I think I take, and I was reading some of Jared's work actually, and before he came on the show, and it's like, this project, the decolonization, like I think it becomes like a buzzword, right? There's probably a documentary on that now that's like all like, about self-healing and stuff like that. But our minds are so colonized to the point that we can't actually imagine something, in the past or in the present or in the future that is outside of these conditions, right? And I think that's incredibly powerful, to the point we're believing the FBI, that we've internalized that narrative about ourselves, that we are misogynist, that we are killers, that are here, like that we cannot have heroes. We cannot have a revolutionary past or a revolutionary present or a revolutionary future. And to me, that's the first thing. That's what colonization is about. It's not just about colonizing the land. It's about taking away the sense of a future, right? And how do you do that? You destroy the past. And I think that's what this documentary does. It's the effect. It may not be the intention, but it's the effect of it. It completely obscures and obfuscates the very issues that the people at that time period were fighting for. It even distorts the figure of Anna Mae Aquash. She was somebody who's ride or die AIM at the end of the day. And we talk about this in the podcast episode we did, and everyone I've talked to had immense amount of respect for her as somebody who was, who was diehard, who would give her life. And it's sad to me. It's really sad for her children. I feel for them. Like I don't know what it's like to grow up that way, but the person that they're trying to honor in that film is not the person who she actually was. She was.
Sorry, no, go ahead. Finish. Sorry.
No. And I'll just quote Hank Adams, who is somebody, he's an interesting figure at that time period. He was not entirely 100% AIM, but he was down for the Red Power movement. He was militant in his own ways, had his own faults, but he said Anna Mae's ways were AIM's ways, good or bad. And he's somebody who knew her. And I think we have to like wrestle with that fact. You can't like just refashion her as some kind of martyr at the end of the day. You can't refashion her as somebody who was the victim of the very people who she was laying down her life for, right? Because that's not what happened.
So that, again, that's a powerful point that you're making there. Well, several of them, but one. So I just want to. So how would you recommend that those of us less familiar with these issues and these people view her and then AIM? Are you so the claim that she? Yeah. What is your theory of what happened then? And or how we or maybe the best way to approach what happened in her case, because that's a very interesting point that you're making there about how she should or should not be remembered and what this film is or is not doing.
Mm-hmm. I think just based on what I know and what people have told me and the evidence that I have seen, I do think that Theda Clark was the person who killed her. But I also think Theda Clark was somebody who was deeply troubled because she herself was an FBI informant. According to the sources that I have, and I don't make that claim lightly. It's something that I don't, it's not to say like, oh, there's like FBI informants everywhere, but they did have sources. And even in these books, they are talking to people who are AIM members who are just giving over information. They're becoming informants for the state, whether they are willingly, knowingly doing that. That's what happens when you talk to the police. You just become an informant of the state. And in the course of these,
there's something happening with your mic. I think is that his mic that's doing this.
Is it cracking?
Okay, yeah, it's cracking. Sorry, it just got really bad there for a second. That's much.
How about
better
now?
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
So they become like they became like, a lot of people were just doing these, you know, there was no like, hey, I'm not going to talk to the cops kind of thing. And so you kind of get a lot of this information based on these interviews that they have done, but also people begin to change their stories because now they're implicated. Now they become sort of coerced into becoming key witnesses of the state. And then out of it, they craft this narrative that we've already covered. But at the end of the day, I think it was I don't think it was a planned out decision. I think it was a hasty decision that they made, that Theda Clarkin made to kill her. Okay. And I think she was trying to get the legitimacy of people to buy on to this thing. People were just like completely like, what the F is going on here? And that's what a lot of people say. Like, I had no idea that this was going to lead to this. But at the end of the day, like, think about it. The FBI was supposed to undergo reforms in the 1970s after Hoover, right? Especially around the way they handled informants. But yet we have people like James Whitey Bulger, who's out there murdering people as an FBI informant, like probably hundreds of people. You have Greg Scarpa Sr., right? All recruited at the top echelons, right? And there's no accountability within the FBI, right? There's no accountability in terms of like murderers as informants. And what does it mean? There's no statute of limitations on murder. But why did they wait 30 years? Why did they wait 30 years? You know, it's enough kind of like mental break in time to say like, well, you know, nobody's going to look at the FBI. But the DOJ, in one of its own, by its own admissions in the 90s, stated very clearly one of the reasons why they didn't want to prosecute these individuals is, one, there's no material evidence, but also it lends legitimacy that this was an FBI cover-up. And from what I can tell, it actually was an FBI cover-up. I mean, looking at even the way they described Anna Mae in 1976 in these FBI documents, a year after her body was found and identified, they keep talking about her as an unidentified Indian female. You know, they keep referring to her as unidentified girl, unidentified female Indian, unidentified victim. So, you know, they still hadn't, you know, come to terms with like, she's identified, she's, you know, this is a person who murdered her. So I think it's that, like, at the end of the day, it's like, it's easier to just say, we didn't know what happened. Let's let these, you know, these investigators, these hard-nosed investigators, Abe Alonzo and Bob Ekafy, solve the case that we refuse to do anything about from the very beginning.
Nick Estes, thank you very much. It's been great. From the homework assignment to the analysis to the discussion, it's been great. And like I said, I look forward to doing much more. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No, anytime. And
you a historian, you was doing there, a big one. I said, you better give us all the facts, you know, line it up in a timeline.
Oh, I just scratched the surface, and I texted Jared a little bit about this. But if you ever want to go a little bit deeper, you know, it's not putting the tinfoil hat on. A lot of this is what I'm saying, y'all. A lot of this research is out in the public. I'm not doing anything. I'm not like drawing this big, you know, point A, point B. This is, I'm using what the state has said about itself and what it knew. I'm not like revealing any secrets. I'm just saying, like, I'm using the documents are coming. You know, I'm not even like weighing in on what people have told me. You know, I'm just like using, this is what the state said. This is what they knew. And what they knew doesn't line up with what happened.
Do you go in more detail on your podcast about these episodes?
We do. So yeah. And I think we want to do another one based on it's just going to be called like Pretendian Informants, because there's a phenomenon of mostly non-native folks claiming to be native, infiltrating movements, going back to the AIM days. Like Doug Durham was a white guy who claimed to be native. We have the case of Cyril Chapman. I'm probably going to do a podcast episode on him because his impact on the movement at that time period was pretty fascinating. His connections are interesting as well. He's still around. You know, he's still making documentaries. He's rebranded himself.
But he was an informant too, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yep. And it's outed in the court. It's not like I'm making that speculation. He's the lawyers, the defense attorneys for Dick Marshall, who was one of the people who were indicted but was found not guilty, kind of exposed this.
Okay, but yeah, I'm gonna look it up on the podcast.
So I saw the one you did on Anna Mae. I didn't know you did more on the series itself.
Oh
so
no, my plan is to do another another episode. Yeah. Probably won't happen until after the new year, but I just want to say one last thing. There's a lot of things happening right now with the FBI. It's on the back foot. Trump is coming to power and claiming to, he's going to, Chris Wray is stepping down, but it's also at this moment, we see Biden pardoning his son. And then also, I think he granted clemency to I think it was 1,500 people.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
he pardoned 1,500, 39 got clean, right?
Yeah. And so the political winds are shifting in favor of Leonard Peltier's clemency right now, and want people to kind of be aware of that. And that's not because of insider dealing at the White House. That's because everyday grassroots people have kept that campaign and that truth alive. At the end of the day, you go to Oglala, everyone knows who Leonard Peltier is. Everyone knows who Anna Mae was. They loved her. She was considered part of the community there. This is something it's almost as if it happened yesterday for them. It's still embedded in that base of support, that grassroots base of support. And at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. Whatever victory or whatever, people claim, these policy shifts, it happens because everyday people have struggled, laid down their lives, sat in prison, and sacrificed for the freedom of our people.
Right on. Thank you very much. We'll make sure the link to the podcast is in the show description and invite people to check it out. And Nick, thank you very much. Look forward to talking with you again.
Right on.
Take good care. All right. Peace.